Good evening.
Maher or Mahar? Maher.
Welcome to the Saturday night plenary of Left Forum. Thank you. My name is Rob Robinson. I'm one of the members of the board of directors of this conference. On behalf of the board of directors, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for your attendance this weekend. Tonight's plenary features an array of speakers, of which we'll give you some information on them a little later. But it follows through. We tried to connect our three plenaries through the theme this year, and we started out Friday night with featuring Jane Sanders and a broken system and how we got here. Tonight, the plenary is titled One Fight, Many Fronts, and then tomorrow we have a vision moving forward, and we hope to close out. As an activist and organizer in New York City, I'm often offering constructive criticism about the way we do our work. And that constructive criticism is saying this, that we are good at painting a picture of what is wrong, but I'd like to see us have a vision of how we want to move forward and what we have to do to move forward, right? What are the steps that we need to take to build the kind of society and system that we want to see? So hopefully we'll work through that in the plenary. So quickly, for Left Forum 2018, we've had about 1,500 people pre-register. By the time this weekend is over, about 3,000 people would have walked through John Jay and as part of Left Forum, so we appreciate that. For the third year in a row, Left Forum has offered childcare. It's always been a struggle for us. Thank you. And we encourage you to tell your friends or those who think that we don't have childcare that this will continue into the future. It's been a struggle for us to put this together, but we finally figured out a system and we have it up and running, and it's, as I said, it's in its third year. We will have a survey of this conference that we hope that you would take the time and log onto our website. It'll be posted on Wednesday. You will receive an email about this. Also, it'll be embedded in that email. We want this conference to be a reflection of what you want to see and what you are thinking. As board members and as staff, and we're a small staff, there are 2.5 staff persons and a core of volunteers that put this conference together. It is not a big staff, so we encourage you to share your ideas and thoughts of what you want this conference to be. And the only way you can do that is by communicating that information to us. So please take a minute, starting Wednesday after you receive that email, to visit www.leftforum.org and take a minute to fill out that survey. It'll probably be a 10-question survey at most, but it'll be a reflection of what you think of what you saw this weekend and what you want to see going forward. So thank you. On your seats, you will find a little envelope. This is a little bit of a challenge to put a conference together of this size. It takes a lot of resources. We have a small staff. As I said, we have 2.5 staff people. So we do this based on donations and the conference fees to keep this thing up and running. So on your chair is an envelope. If you see it, we hope that you would make a donation to Left Forum, and at the end of this conference, there will be a box at the back where you can drop in any donations that you want to make to us at Left Forum into that box. As we end this plenary, all of tonight's plenary speakers have recent publications of books. We have a book signing session that will be set up after this plenary. If you want to purchase one of the speakers' books, they are available on the tables to my left. And then the book signing area will be where another one of our board members, Sam, raise your hand. That's where the book signing will take place. That is Samantha Desire, one of our board members. Longtime volunteer and eventually became a board member. So we look to incorporate the voices of the young people of color into this movement, and that's a change that we want to do at Left Forum. It takes time, but we are working towards that direction. So with that, you've heard enough from me. I want to introduce our moderator for tonight's discussion. So Paul Jay is a journalist, filmmaker, and founder and senior editor of the Real News Network. It's an independent, fact-based, online, international news and current affairs network. In 2013, under Paul's leadership, the Real News relocated its headquarters to Baltimore and created the Baltimore Bureau. And in 2016, the organization created and dedicated Climate Crisis Bureau. Born and raised in Toronto, Paul was the founding chair of the Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary. Without further ado, our moderator for tonight's panel, Mr. Paul Jay.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Left Forum. To get started, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panel, and it is an esteemed panel. It's not just a word that everyone says when they introduce a panel. First of all, Silvia... Oh, you can't see. You want us at the podium. All right. You can't hear, you can't see.
Bring the microphone closer unless you want to stand.
All right. Now, they say they can't see, so we'll go to the podium, okay?
What's the difference if you see?
I don't know.
Still can't see.
All right. All right. That was an easy applause to get. All right, first of all, Silvia Federici is an Italian-American scholar, teacher, and activist from the radical, autonomous, feminist, Marxist tradition. She's a professor emerita and teaching fellow at Hofstra University, where she was a social science professor. She worked as a teacher in Nigeria for many years and is also the co-founder of the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa and is a member of the Midnight Notes Collective. Juan Gonzalez is an award-winning broadcast journalist, an investigative reporter, a two-time winner of the George Polk Award. He's co-host of Democracy Now!, which I'm sure everyone in this room knows. He's author of Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, and a founder of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. He spent 29 years as a columnist for the New York Daily News. George Ciccariello-Maher is an American political scientist and activist who was an associate professor of politics and global studies at Drexel University and a lecturer in philosophy and political economy at the Venezuelan Ministry of Planning and Finance School of Planning. Dr. Gerald Horne is an African-American historian who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African Studies at the University of Houston. I should also add he's a regular guest on the Real News Network. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice, in particular communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. While many of Horne's books use a celebrated, intriguing, or politically engaged individual as a prism to inspect the historical forces of their times, Horne also produced broad canvases, chronicles of infrequently examined periods and aspects of the history of white supremacy and imperialism, such as the post-Civil War involvement of the U.S. ruling class, newly dispossessed of human chattels, with slavery in Brazil, which was not legally abolished until 1888, or the attempts of Japanese imperialists in the mid-20th century to appear as the leaders of a global war against white supremacy, thus allies and instruments of liberation of color oppressed by Anglo-American empire. Gerald Horne is one of the most gifted and insightful historians on racial matters of his generation, and if I were to read you the list of all his books, it would take up the entire time scheduled for this panel. So please welcome our panel for tonight. So, first of all, let me apologize. If I speak off the top of my head, I will ramble and take too long. So I've written out some remarks. I've been asked to set up this evening, and I'm going to give a broad sketch of where I think we humans are at. The more I looked at it, the more it scared the hell out of me. But that's sort of the point. We need to tell people the whole truth about the urgency of this historical moment, the existential threat of this moment. And of course, it can feel overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be paralyzing. While the fight for health care for all, a higher minimum wage, against systemic racism, for unionization, and all necessary reforms and fights to do with the day-to-day struggle, they're critical to engaging people, but we also need to tell people the whole truth about just how dire the big picture is. There's no need to treat working people, or ourselves for that matter, as infants. The whole culture is aimed at the infantilization of political discussion. We either believe that America is already great or make America great again, but it's all a religion of Americanism, and it's all meant to make us willing children who will march into battle or just resign ourselves to things as they are. As catastrophic and savage as capitalism was during the 20th century, continuous wars and genocides, deep economic crisis, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, the system proved to be resilient. The global elites did find a kind of equilibrium. Capitalism did not come to an end, and attempts at socialism failed. While many societies around the world have been destroyed, millions of people slaughtered in war, and many more living in deep poverty, the truth is the majority of people in the advanced capitalist world are doing okay. In the United States, there are as many families earning over $100,000 a year as there are earning under $30,000 in actual numbers. But as resilient as capitalism has proved to be, I don't think this world order is sustainable. The elites are no longer capable or willing to deal with grave systemic threats, even when it's in their own long-term interest to do so. We're in a different kind of moment than we've ever faced before. Of course, nuclear weapons posed an existential threat in the past, but at least the elites saw that ending human life on Earth wasn't in their interests. That is, so far that's true. Because as crazy as the prospect for nuclear war is, they have not given up their deteriorating, hair-triggered nuclear arsenals. And they actually contemplate the use of localized nuclear weapons. As you know, first Obama and now Trump is spending billions expanding Americans' nuclear capability. While it's unlikely the elites will deliberately launch a nuclear Armageddon, we're all living in denial if we think that an accidental triggering of such isn't possible. The hair trigger policy means there's around 10 minutes to decide if what looks like an attack actually is one, or is a glitch in the software. It's a Cold War posture still in place in the United States and Russia. It's Dr. Strangelove's doomsday machine, and we can't have faith in the political leadership of these elites, that the current leadership of either the Republican or Democratic Party, or the billionaires that bankroll them, to face up to this danger. One would think it's in the interest of the elites themselves to deal with this. But the military-industrial complex has far too much invested in a narrative that depends on a major existential threat. They need war, and almost war. American capital will not give up its domination of its global commercial position, and they believe it depends on their military might. Oil and guns determine U.S. foreign policy, not national security. On this point alone, one can argue that the ruling class is not fit to rule. The threat of blowing up the world and their inability to deal with it. But of course, there's more. Modern industrial capitalism has given rise to the climate crisis, a clear and objective existential threat to human and all living things. I'm sure everyone here has heard the basic facts, and the process is speeding up. Leading climate science have modeled that by the year 2050, we will cross the 2-degree threshold of temperature increasing above pre-industrial temperatures. That model was based on if all the countries that signed the Paris Accords lived up to their commitments. Of course, this modeling was done before the election of a climate denier as president. And with Obama, of course, we've had the undoing of far too modest measures that were passed under Obama. So what does that mean to the model of 2050? It's possible we're crossing 2 degrees in 20 years. I mean, most people in this room are going to see it, and certainly our children are going to see it. Once that threshold is crossed, apparently it's far more difficult to slow and reverse the process. Yet, according to Media Matters, in the 2016 election, the 4 major broadcast channels, NBC, CBS, Fox, ABC, They gave climate crisis, the climate change story, 96 minutes of coverage in the entire election year. And those numbers included Fox, so most of their coverage was actually climate denial. According to a Yale poll, only 13% of people know that more than 90% of scientists believes human activity causes the climate crisis, the climate change. And of course, it's actually more like 97% of scientists. When it comes to voting, the climate crisis is barely on anyone's radar. Yet it's clearly the gravest threat humans ever faced. You would think that the elites would find it in their own interest to take action, given the apocalyptic consequence of denial or impotent action. But effective policy requires taking on the fossil fuel industry. It really requires changing how things are owned and who has power. It means transforming the economy and relations between people. They won't go there, even though the consequences are terrifying. They're not fit to rule. Artificial intelligence is here and rapidly advancing. It will soon produce a world with millions less jobs. Truck and taxi drivers, to doctors, to name the occupation. You name your occupation. Millions and millions of jobs are disappearing in the next decade or two. We're not even talking about much. The top 20% of the population won't need the rest of the 80%. They imagine a world of artificial intelligent robots creating wealth, and we're on the precipice of it. If you're a capitalist, a world with massive unemployment might not seem so bad, workers trying to compete against the cost of robots. And that's why I think the elites who think about such things are not more alarmed about climate change. Rather than take the necessary measures to transform the economy to one that's green and sustainable, they're literally planning to head for the hills. I recently introduced Rana Foroohar, who writes for the Financial Times, and she knows everyone on Wall Street. I said, they have kids, they have grandkids. Don't they know what's coming? And she says, yeah, they all have escape plans. They're buying land in New Zealand, Northern Ontario. They imagine cities on the hill serviced by robots. Their greatest fear is not the cataclysmic destruction of the rest of humanity, but that AI will take over from the humans. Frankly, in that world, I'm rooting for the robots. This ruling class is not fit to rule. The digital revolution makes all this possible. It's also allowed the process of financialization and globalization to grow qualitatively to a qualitatively greater scale. Imagine creating complex derivative products with a pencil and paper. There's no Amazon or Walmart without computers to create such a beautifully efficient global supply chain. And of course, to play cheap global labor off against American workers, which has basically stalled wage increases and hollowed much of the industrial working class. Why can't the ruling elites deal with the systemic threats of climate change, financial crisis, global war, and artificial intelligence? Threats to the future of their own system, because they are in the middle of an orgy of profit-making. They can't believe their good fortune. If they had any doubts before the election, now Wall Street loves Trump, but this certainly didn't start with Trump. Even though that most of finance, most of Wall Street knows that unregulated Wall Street, that it's only a matter of time before the crisis of 07-08 repeats itself. But what the hell, no one will go to jail and the public will bail them out again, they believe. And if they actually think beyond their private jets and yachts, they think that, well, we'll be okay. Our kids will be okay. Probably our grandchildren will be okay. And after that, après moi le déluge. After me comes the flood, said Louis XV. And in Maryland, we just saw much of a city just washed away, literally. And it's surely the shape of things to come. And anyone looks at it, and they look at it, They know this is the shape of things to come. And those individuals in the elites who see what's coming and are sounding the alarm, and there are more than a few, even they're marginalized. Of course, corporate media plays a critical role in all of this. They're far too concerned about Russiagate and Trump's tweets than the critical issues facing us, and for obvious reasons. But one wonders how the producers and journalists can live with themselves. Everything, as always, comes down to a simple question. Who has political power, and how will stuff be owned? If we have no faith in the ruling elites, and we shouldn't, then we have to change who controls government and build the public sector to challenge the power of the oligarchy. And we have to tell working people the whole truth. We can't treat people as infants, that all they can worry about is the most immediate things that face them. Working people can get the big picture as well as anyone in this room. The lead up to the 2020 elections will be a critical time to tell this whole truth, and the outcome of those elections can't be overestimated. As much as the digital revolution helped create a vile stratum of the ultra-rich, it also created the conditions for something new. The Sanders campaign has shown that political structures that were built to look democratic, because the power of the billionaires would always win out, can be challenged with mass fundraising. Online organizing and independent media can challenge the power of concentrated media ownership. And importantly, imagine a publicly owned Amazon or Apple or JP Morgan. These are essentially planned and rational economies. We've been told planned economies aren't possible. But artificial intelligence and digitization have actually created massive planned economies right in front of our eyes. But around these planned economies, the economy and politics is increasingly insane. You can't have a planned national economy with a pencil and paper. We've seen what that led to in the Soviet Union. But artificial intelligence gives us the promise of a planned, green, and sustainable economy. The problem is the tremendous promise of artificial intelligence is being strangled by private ownership, whose only objective is profit. Stephen Hawking said just before he died that in the end, the fight over who controls artificial intelligence is the greatest fight we have before us. It can't be separated from the fight to develop a rational climate policy or a more equitable society. We must assert the people's interest, from banking to technology, and most importantly, climate policy. And we must tell working people the whole truth about how urgent our situation is. All over the country and the world, people are organizing to fight for such change. And in spite of the dire moment we're in, I believe people are ready to act. When working people really get what's facing them, they'll not be fooled if we do our job. We must tell people the whole truth. So joining me to discuss how there are many fights, on many struggles, on many fronts, I'm joined by my panel, and I'm going to ask Gerald Horne to take over. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to the left.
They want us to stand.
Okay.
We can't see over each other's head. You don't have to.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Left Forum for inviting me here. I'm going to try to sketch about 400 or 500 years of history in 10 minutes. But 15 minutes, okay. But for those who find that too oppressive, let me say that there are books, of course, over there that go into more detail. And also, I'd point you to a lecture on YouTube that I gave at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in February 2018 that sort of fleshes out some of these points. Now, the charge before us is towards a new strategy for the left, which presupposes that we need a new strategy, which presupposes further that the strategies up to this point apparently have not been very effective. Otherwise, I don't think we'd be asking for a new strategy. And the rather sobering news is that even though I'm sure, like myself, you'll be working like hell to make sure that Trumpism is defeated in November 2018 and November 2020, the fact of the matter is, I'm afraid to say, that Trumpism as a phenomenon will be with us for some time to come. It's not a one-off. It's not necessarily a deviation from the broad scope of U.S. history. It's more like a culmination for reasons I'll try to at least sketch generally. And given the fact that it may be with us for some time to come, it's well past time not only to develop a new strategy, but also perhaps to develop a new concept of why it is that U.S. imperialism exists, or more to the point, why are we in North America at this moment speaking English when we could just as well have been speaking Dutch, or just as well been speaking a number of Native American languages with simultaneous translation. And in order to get to a point that we can answer that question, it may be useful to begin with by examining a number of recent incidents and asking why. I'm sure you're familiar with the Philadelphia Starbucks incident, the barbecuing while black incident in Oakland, the black woman arrested for studying at a common space in Yale, all of the police killings of Eric Garner and Philando Castile and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland. And I think that we should begin to draw reasonable inferences from uncontested facts. That is to say, during the war in Vietnam, the question often was this genocidal war some sort of one-off, some sort of deviation from U.S. imperialism, or whether it was the logical working out of the contradictions of U.S. imperialism. And likewise, with regard to what's happening to a significant part of the citizenry of this country, we need to ask ourselves, is this just a coincidence, all of these police killings and arrests and calling the police? Or is there something deeper at play? And if there is something deeper at play, what is it? Well, fortunately, I think it's also fair to say that some of the liberal scholars have been doing a fair job of answering these questions, in some ways better than the scholars who consider themselves to the left of liberalism. I mean, for example, the book by Robert Parkinson, The Common Cause, on 1776, the founding of the United States. The common cause being massive dispossession of the indigenous and continued enslavement of the Africans. Or the recent book by Harvard Law professor Michael Claremont, The Framers' Coup, and look at the Constitution. Unlike many of our friends on the left who see the Constitution as the last word and, quote, democracy, unquote, as the title of this book suggests, he takes a more pinched view, which actually is part of the schizophrenic view of many of our friends on the left, who oftentimes at once celebrate this archaic, antiquated document, yet lament its fruits, be it the Electoral College, which allows a person to get fewer votes in 2016 and still be elected president, which of course stems from a decision in the late 18th century to give more weight to slave-owning states, or even the Second Amendment, which leads to these mass shootings, which can erupt at any second, and particularly they seem to be erupting in churches and high schools as of late, which, as you know, stems from this fear of uprisings by the indigenous population and uprising by enslaved Africans, and therefore there was a need for citizen militias in order to suppress them, and therefore it was decided that a better part of wisdom was to make sure that the population is armed. Now, or at least the Euro-American population is armed, I should say, to correct myself. So the point that I'm making is that if you look at the history of this country, it's fair to say that the revolt against British rule that led to the formation of the United States in the late 18th century, which has led to us communicating in this language developed in Northwest Europe, was driven in no small measure by the decision by London in 1763 with the Royal Proclamation to keep the settlers, led by real estate speculator number one, George Washington, from moving further west, coming into conflict with the Native Americans, causing London to expend tremendous amounts of blood and treasure to propel that illicit process. And rather than see that kind of process end, the settlers led by George Washington kicked out London. And secondly, Somerset's case in June 1772, where England abolished slavery, and there was this fear that this decision would leapfrog the Atlantic, jeopardizing fortunes of a murderer's row of founding fathers, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, etc. And they kicked London out. Now, any of you who know anything about settlers' revolts, be it Algeria in the late 1950s or Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe in 1965, know that they're inherently problematic. Or any of you who know anything about settler colonialism, be it in North America today or what used to be called historic Palestine, now Israel, for example, or Australia, beginning after, interestingly enough, the British are kicked out of what is now the United States, know that it involves mass dispossession of an indigenous population and a sort of installation into power of a favored class of individuals. And what's interesting about the United States is its construction of whiteness. That is to say, those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, British versus German, German versus Pole, German versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, Greek versus Macedonian, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. Once they crossed the Atlantic, voila, magically they're transmuted into this new identity politics, a militarized identity politics, if you like, of whiteness. Now, at once, this helps to reconcile conflicts and differences that they might have endured in Europe, particularly like English versus Irish, one of the first aspects of this construction of whiteness. But second of all, it's sort of what we used to call in the trade union movement a kind of pork chop unity. That is to say, they're united on this reactionary platform and premise of looting the indigenous and enslaving on a mass basis the Africans. And so I think that in terms of developing a new strategy for the left, it may be useful to go back to re-examine the history of this country, and out of the examination of the history of this country, perhaps we can develop a new strategy. I should also say that if you look at the broad expanse of North Atlantic history, it's quite striking to note how at issue in terms of mass transformations and what were thought to be progressive transformations was oftentimes the question of slavery and dispossession. I mean, if you look at the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, you see that the merchants rise up against the monarch because they want to elbow their way into the lucrative nature of the African slave trade, which oftentimes delivers profits of 1,700%. And so they clip the wings of the monarch and then call for the deregulation of the African slave trade and free trade in Africans, which leads to people like myself winding up in North America. Or as noted about 1776, a similar process, or 1836 with Texas seceding from Mexico because Mexico had moved towards abolition in the 1820s. And then the final defeat in 1861 with the Confederate States of America. So given the fact that profit through enslavement has been a driving force in the history of the North Atlantic nations, particularly in the United States of America, it should not be surprising that we see these incidents in Oakland and in Philadelphia, et cetera, nor should it be surprising that given the fact that one of the largest uncompensated expropriations of private property up to that point was the expropriation of property in the bodies of enslaved Africans in 1865, oftentimes when I'm describing this to my students, and being students in 2018, they're oftentimes fiddling with their smartphones as I'm talking, and I'll go up and grab their smartphone and say, this is what's called an uncompensated expropriation of private property. And I'm sure you're not happy about that. You might even want to take me outside and thrash me. Well, this is, of course, what happened in 1865 in Dixie, so no wonder a Ku Klux Klan arises. No wonder we're still bedeviled by the legacy of that rather tortured and troubled history. And little wonder that many of our elite analysts are talking about fascism today, be it Madeleine Albright in her book Fascism: A Warning, or the Harvard law professor Cass Sunstein and Can It Happen Here, a play on the novel It Can Happen Here from the 1930s about the rise of fascism, or the deceased novelist Philip Roth in his book The Plot Against America, Michael Kinsley, okay, or Timothy Snyder of Yale and Tyranny and the Road to Unfreedom, unfreedom, of course, being sort of a euphemism for fascism, or Michael Kinsley, the heir to the Microsoft fortune through marriage, who first sounded the alarm about Trump as a fascist. But the problem with their analyses is not, number one, they don't seem to see a connection between fascism arising in a country that tolerated slavery and apartheid for centuries and decades, and how that creates a fertile womb for the rise of fascism. I guess because they think it's normalized behavior to treat black people in a fascist manner, and that everybody else can sort of go along and escape, basically. And number two, with regard to U.S. foreign policy, they don't draw a connection between helping to engineer a fascist coup in Chile on September 11, 1973, or backing apartheid South Africa into a tactical retreat in the spring of 1994. They don't see a connection between that foreign policy and how that creates the seeds for fascism here. That's where we should be able to intervene. And I know that my time, I'll have time to elaborate on these points further. Okay. So the other historical point I'd like to make is that if you look at the broad expanse of history over the last few hundred years, you'll see that in the North Atlantic nations in particular, there has been this transition from religious conflict, Protestant versus Catholic in Great Britain, for example, and Catholic versus Muslim in terms of the Crusades, and Catholic, Christian versus Jewish, for example, in Europe. And then crossing the Atlantic and then the advent of settler colonialism, you see, as particularly as embodied in the First Amendment, a transition from religion as an axis of society to race as an axis of society. And of course, many of our liberal historians, they'll celebrate the First Amendment, talking about this movement away from religious sectarianism, but don't flip the coin over and look that it's really just replaced by race. And the same holds true for colonialism as well, which oftentimes was pivoted upon the point of race. Now, what happens to change that oftentimes are external events. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, leads to a general crisis of the entire slave system that can only be resolved with its collapse, which then, with slavery abolished, that helps to give impetus to a class-based movement. It's no accident that struggles for an 8-hour day, the struggles of the Knights of Labor and union movements erupt in North America in particular after the U.S. Civil War and the abolition of slavery. But what's happened as we've gone from this transition from religion to race to class is that obviously the class-based project has suffered grievous wounds. So there's no surprise that, for example, in Italy, which once boasted one of the largest and most significant left-wing movements in the capitalist world, now you have the rise of a certain kind of neo-fascism. Nor is it surprising that in North America, in the 1950s, when the fateful decision was made to retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, by dint of Brown versus Board of Education, followed by Civil Rights Acts, etc. At the same time, you have this advance on the race front, you have a retreat on the class front, because that's accompanied by this Red Scare attack on progressive trade unions, International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union, National Maritime Union, etc. And so that leads to this rather blinkered idea that the U.S. ruling elite cares more about black people than they do about the so-called white working class, because as you know, class is a race phenomenon. When you talk about class, you only could talk about the white working class. And then that helps to plant seeds that then gives rise to this phenomenon of Trumpism. But I think to conclude, the point that I'm trying to make is that if you look at the broad expanse and broad scope of North American settler colonialism followed by U.S. history, that progressive transformation oftentimes has been induced by external factors, be it the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, be it the rise of a socialist camp and national liberation movements that puts pressure on the United States to move away from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. And so part of the lesson in terms of developing a new strategy for the left and to make it and to put it on a micro level is that in a few weeks there will be an election in Mexico where a left-wing candidate is now leading in the polls, but of course he's led in the polls before and has been defeated. But let's say that this proves out, it seems to me that that opens up a wonderful opportunity for the left, particularly given the large population of Mexican descent, not only in the Southwest and California, but also right here in New York City, where we can link the local and the global. We can begin to expand the battlefield to our benefit, and then finally, taking advantage of what Trump has done for us. What has he done for us, you ask? Well, he's helped to introduce rifts into the capitalist world. I'm sure you must have seen what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said, and of course, he's not necessarily one of our radical left friends, but I think that it reflects a growing sentiment in Canada with regard to what's happening in the United States, with regard to what's happening in Germany concerning this negative reaction to Trumpism. We already know about the growth of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So I think there's a possibility for creating this global movement that we can now facilitate because we have such useful instruments as the Real News. We have the use of the internet, which allows us to communicate instantaneously around the world. And then we have these large populations of immigrants that are coming under fire who, even if we weren't thinking strategically and globally, we would be duty-bound to come to their defense and assistance in any case. But we have even more of an opportunity and a reason to come to their defense and aid because now we see it as part of a larger global strategy based on history, based on the history of progress in North America, that then will undergird a new strategy for the left. Thank you very much.
Juan?
Good evening, and thank you to the Left Forum for inviting me. I'm not quite sure why you invited me to speak here. I don't have prepared remarks because I've been involved with a bunch of other things lately. Didn't have the time to get them prepared, but I think I basically have a good understanding of what the thrust and the direction of this conference is and what you're hoping to come away with from this conference. Which is not only strategy but hope, and I come to bring you hope, because I am, despite all of the dire problems that we face today, I come increasingly sensing that there is great hope for social progress and among social movements not only in the United States but in the rest of the world. Now, I've spent now 40 years working as a journalist, earning my living as a journalist, not as a political analyst, or I have done quite a bit of work in terms of understanding the history of different institutions and groups with which I have grown up with throughout my life. And we just celebrated a few weeks ago the 50th anniversary of the Columbia student strike, of which I was a participant back in 1968. And I was able to spend about 10 years before I became a professional journalist as a social and community activist in a variety of organizations, not just the Students for Democratic Society, but then the Young Lords Party, the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, the African Liberation Support Committee. Even as I continued working as a professional journalist, I had the opportunity at different stages in my journey through journalism to help organize my fellow journalists in labor actions, surprisingly, all of which turned out to be pretty successful. We had in 1985 a 5-week strike in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Daily News and Philadelphia Inquirer, where we won, I think, the last great contract of any newspaper union in America back in 1985. A few years later, in 1990-91, I had the good fortune or bad fortune to have been involved and be a strike leader of the New York Daily News strike, which lasted for 5 months, and which we also somehow managed to defeat one of these giant media companies, the Tribune Company. And then, of course, back in 2000, 2001, the big battle we had at Pacifica to try to prevent the corporate takeover of Pacifica, which lasted over a year, and actually won for that period of time. Things have changed over the years, but at least it was able to prevent that. So I've had the good fortune to have participated in many mass struggles over the years which have managed to win their goals. Back in 1968, we all thought a new world was dawning. In 1968 and 69, we thought the revolution was just around the corner. As Paul has mentioned, capitalism has proven to be an amazingly resilient system. We always had the argument: does the base determine the base determine the superstructure, or superstructure determine base? Well, capitalism has always been able to figure out its threats to it and come up with new ways to maintain its power. And of course, it was helped along the line by the collapse of the socialist experiments of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and opening up all these new markets that previously had been shut off to world capitalist development. So I think that I've tried to deal with my own my own ability to be involved in these struggles and somehow win immediate success against the larger problem that we all face, that the capitalist system has continued to become more entrenched throughout the world. And so that would seem to indicate a pessimistic analysis. Well, I think one of the things that is most important to grab hold of, I always have this argument with Amy Goodman, my co-host on Democracy Now! And others. I believe the most important thing that happened in the 20th century was that the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America stood up. Colonialism, the old system of colonialism, was ended in the 20th century. Now, it happened because, and this is my own analysis, some historians might differ with me on this, the necessity of all of the various imperialist nations when they went into World War II to win the war required them to draft their colonial subjects into their armies, and required them to go to the colonies and come up with more soldiers to fight. As a result, you see, if anyone who studies the civil rights movement in the United States, who studies the rise of the Mexican-American and Puerto Rican movement in the United States, that studies the rise of the anti-colonial movements around the world, realizes that it was many of the colonial soldiers who fought in World War II who came back to the colonies and demanded the same kinds of freedom and independence that Europe and the United States were espousing. So that the necessity to impress the colonial subjects into World War II laid the basis for the independence movements that arose afterwards, whether it was in India or in Algeria or throughout much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And then something else started to happen. The third world started coming to the West. After World War II, you started having all of these mass flows of people from those colonies to the colonizer nations. What is the main thing propelling most of the fascist movements in the advanced capitalist world today? It's anti-immigrant fervor, anti-immigrant xenophobia. In France, they don't know what to do about all the Tunisians and the Moroccans and the Algerians. In England, they don't know what to do about all the Pakistanis, Indians, and Jamaicans. In Germany, they don't know what to do about all the Turks. In the United States, they don't know what to do about all the Latin Americans and Caribbeans and others from the third world that have come to the West. When you look at the immigrant flows, the people have come precisely from the nations that once were their colonial masters. The reason there are so many Algerians, Tunisians, and Moroccans in France is because those were the colonies of France. The reason there's so many Pakistanis, Indians, and Jamaicans in England is because those were the colonies of England. And the reason there are so many Latin Americans in the United States, no matter what Trump or any of the others say, is because Latin America was the incubator of the American overseas empire. It was where all the great multinational companies were first born in Latin America. So what we have seen increasingly is that the third world has come to the West and has totally begun to transform the actual compositions of these nations. And as a result, there's an increasing backlash from the old members of those nations. Who is a Frenchman? Who is an Englishman? Who is an Englishman? Who is a German? Even who is a Swede today. And so there are all of these battles, and people are trying to grab onto the past when it cannot be grabbed onto. Unfortunately, what has happened increasingly as migrant flows have moved the third world into the West, there is now a whole new consciousness, I believe, in the working class of these countries. Who is the working class? But not the working class that you see on TV, saying that they're all Trump supporters. Who is the real working class of America today? The people who are doing the hardest work, and you find that there's been enormous transformation of the working classes of these countries, and I think this is what is fueling the rise of this new fascist movement, this unease, this sense of fear that the nation they once knew is changing and it has to be stopped. It can't be stopped, of course, because you cannot have a capitalist world where you increasingly break down barriers for capital flows while you erect walls and barriers for labor. You cannot do that. If you are going to reduce the barriers for capital, you must also reduce the barriers for labor to be able to move freely around the world. So I think that that's the big picture. Now, let me get quickly to what I think is what you're looking for more is in terms of strategy. I've spent 40 years now as a journalist basically covering urban America, covering life in urban America, politics in urban America, land policies, tax policies, political leadership. So I think I've gotten a fairly good grasp over the years of what is happening in urban America. And I believe that the key to progressive and radical change increasingly is in our cities. Now, you've got to keep your eye on the national and the state and do the best you can to affect change there. But the reality is that throughout the advanced capitalist world, national governments and regional governments are increasingly growing right-wing. And however, the cities, which are much more diverse and inclusive and hold the majority of the populations of all of these countries, are increasingly going to the left because they are responding to grassroots movements that have developed in many of these cities, and that's part of what I try to talk about in Reclaiming Gotham, how this movement post-Great Recession, post-Occupy, there's been a phenomenal growth of radical and progressive grassroots movement electing people to office, then getting into key positions at office and actually practicing a different type of governance. Because you can criticize capitalist system and the problems of the capitalist system all day long. You have to have a vision of how you would govern differently, what you would do differently. And we have lots of examples of failures of progressive and socialist and left-wing thinking. So we've got to actually be able to provide examples of progressive and radical governance that actually improve the lives of people. So whether it's Anne Hidalgo in Paris, or Ada Colau in Barcelona, or Sadiq Khan in London, or Gail McLaughlin in California, or Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, or Raz Baraka in Newark, or Bill de Blasio here. And I'm not saying that they don't have their problems, every one of them. But the reality is you have movements that have developed, progressive movements that are beginning to seize power in these cities and provide a different perspective and vision of how you can govern. So I think that is that's the first thing. Local struggles that hold people accountable and gain power and show examples of progressive governance at the local level. Second is build the broadest possible unity among progressives. I remember back in 1968, and we were in SDS, and it was Nixon running against Humphrey. And of course, no one liked Humphrey. But we in SDS had the slogan, vote in the streets, vote with your feet. Do not vote in that election. Do not vote. So many of the left boycotted the 1968 election. In retrospect, I think it was one of my biggest mistakes in terms of what Nixon represented from then on as the beginning of the right-wing onslaught that went on for years. So I think that there were other examples over those years of the sectarianism of some of us on the left that refuse to recognize that we can have differences with folks, but treat them with respect and try to find the unities that we can have with anyone who is seeking to build a better life, and that we can find a way to look for the unities first and not for the differences. So I think that the first key issue of any key point of any strategy is one, build local grassroots movement and effectively govern. Two, build the broadest possible unity you can. And then the final critical dividing line between liberals or progressives and radicals is, do you oppose empire? Do you oppose imperial wars of your own government? Do you impose your own governments continuing to attack and intervene in other countries? And do you oppose the restoration of white supremacy? That those are, to me, the key issues. One, build a strong local base, make the revolution locally first before you try to make it nationally. Two, build the broadest possible unity. And three, oppose imperial war, impose empire of your own government. Not that you can oppose somebody, other governments, but the key thing is oppose your own government's attempts to build empire. And to me, those are the three key points that I hope you will take away for whatever strategy you believe out of this conference is the one that you're going to pursue. Thank you.
Like everyone else, I'd like to thank the Left Forum, and particularly for giving me the immense honor of sharing the stage tonight with some of my favorite voices, my favorite thinkers, my favorite writers, and for inviting all of us up here to think through some of the challenges that we face in the attempt to unite really crucial struggles in the present. Now, I think that most of what I say seems obvious, but I think at the same time that some of the most obvious things are the things most in need of being said. In that sense, the first thing that I want to say is that any attempt to formulate a revolutionary strategy for the present necessarily begins with an analysis of that present, the state of the present, the moment in which we live and occupy. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that we live in a moment of resurgent white supremacy and creeping fascism. And indeed a moment in which the line between the two, and the line between the far-right fringe and the institutional power structure of the United States are radically blurred. Often we're told that to confront the fringe is to neglect the institutions, that to attack white supremacists organizing in the streets is to ignore the deep white supremacist structures of the United States. But not only is it the case that these are radically indistinguishable from each other in the present, as we know from the direct connections between white supremacists and the White House, but this is always, in fact, the case. In the past year, open organizing by the far right has helped to sanitize and to mainstream the most rabid and paranoid fantasies of the white American psyche, provoking not only an uptick in mass violence by white men, almost entirely, but also crucially opening a space for institutional transformations and policy shifts coming out of the White House. All of this is to say that confronting the far right and the mainstream right are not different fights, but a single and essential struggle that we must take up. But this is not only about the right either. This right-wing and fascist resurgence grows out of a moment of global polarization that opens up possibilities not only for the far right, but for the far left as well, if we know how to navigate them and if we know how to fight. This global political polarization also has everything to do with liberalism, and it's as much about the Democrats as it is about the Republicans. Specifically, it grows out of the failures of liberalism, its self-defeating, its delusional, and even its suicidal nature. This is visible, I want to say today, on the economic and the political levels alike. Economically, the moment of global polarization that we're living through grows out of the utter failure of neoliberal globalization schemes, whether we're talking about the European Union or NAFTA, that in the context of the financial and economic crisis opens up a path for fascism, fascist organizing, fascist policymaking. Liberals have given no alternative but more neoliberalism, more markets, and an ever great devastation and destruction of people's lives worldwide. Politically, it's been clear for a while that liberalism doesn't know how to fight or even know what it means to fight, bound as it is not only by a poisonous pragmatism, but by a perverse desire to protect even the rights of those who would destroy it. For confirmation of both, of course, we need look no further than Hillary Clinton, a central participant in the brutal neoliberal devastation both in the US and as Secretary of State abroad, as well as in, for example, Honduras, where she essentially endorsed the coup that has brought the devastation that we've seen, the waves of migration that we've seen from Honduras since. This same Hillary Clinton had one job and utterly failed, only to go from declaring Trump a proto-fascist one day to insisting that we give him a chance to govern the next day. And the same Hillary Clinton who, like most Democrats today, speaks of hashtag resistance, only to have the word resistance wrought in their mouths. What does real resistance look like? Real resistance, I think, begins in the present from the recognition that we don't want to give Trump a chance to govern, that we want nothing but abject and total failure for Trump's white supremacist, nativist, xenophobic, misogynistic, and brutally anti-poor policies, and to be completely honest, that we want the same for most of Hillary Clinton's policies as well. Real resistance begins by centering not the Democratic Party, but instead by centering revolutionary and radical movements that are building a real alternative from the ground up. It comes from and takes the form of the explosive growth of a variety of left-wing organizations who are setting themselves the challenge of formulating a strategy for the future outside of and beyond the two-party system by reconnecting with those engaged in mass struggles surging forth everywhere today. Real resistance does not begin within the Democratic Party, but it doesn't set out either from a mechanical and blanket refusal of all electoralism. Instead, it's grounded in a deep skepticism and selectiveness that is itself based on an understanding of political and movement dynamics. Here I would point to the very crucial experiments, for example, with the recent election of Larry Krasner in Philadelphia as district attorney, an election which was driven by the grassroots through years of organizing against police murder and mass incarceration, and in which you've got those very same grassroots organizations and juvenile lifers involved in crafting policymaking today. I would point as well toward the local base building that has been going on for many years in Jackson, Mississippi. But these cases make the point precisely that we only use electoralism to the ends of radical movements and not vice versa, that we not mistake elected leaders for the movements that put them there in the first place. Real resistance also understands that not all history is history, that the legacies of slavery and indigenous dispossession and genocide are lived realities today and are absolutely central to the functioning of US capitalism. And crucially, that struggles against white supremacy are key to detonating broader struggles across society, that the struggles of the most dispossessed, the most oppressed, and the most exploited have the potent capacity to, in the words of Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, throw the governing structures of the United States into chaos. This is not the caricature of what is so often called identity politics and dismissed by some on the left. It is real historical analysis. And as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor also emphasizes, real resistance sets out from the knowledge that it is direct action and resistance by movements in the streets that really has the power to set these broader transformations into motion. From Occupy to Ferguson and Baltimore to Standing Rock, and to more recent spontaneous resistance to the so-called Muslim ban, this undeniable truth of the power of direct action, street action, must guide our struggles today. Real resistance understands, as I mentioned before, that Trump and the Nazis are not so different after all, but in fact deeply similar and deeply intertwined, and that we can't afford to fight one and not the other. Destroying the ability of white supremacists to organize in public is necessary if we're going to push back the policies that Trump is putting into practice. So yes, punch Nazis, please, and organize direct action, grassroots community resistance to policing, to mass incarceration, to deportation. Understand that these are two faces of the same fascist coin. Real resistance recognizes that we do not need to tolerate the far right. We don't need to protect our enemies. We need to destroy them. And since they want to talk so much about safe spaces, we can admit that yes, we want to make campuses safe spaces, but also broader society safe spaces from white supremacy and from fascism. We need to fight for campuses for the same strategic reasons that the right is targeting them, but we also need to do so in a way that consciously breaks down barriers inside universities and those separating them from society as a whole, bringing together faculty, tenured and untenured, adjunct and precarious, with a brutally indebted student body and those workers whose labor makes those campuses function. And real resistance fights not only against, but also for. The two are in fact inseparable, since there is no revolutionary strategy without the accumulation of an organized alternative. What this means today is that we must confront this violent Janus face of institutionalized fascism in the United States, the police and immigration enforcement. Recall that both the Fraternal Order of Police and the Border Patrol Union endorsed Trump, because both demand the ability to brutalize and to murder black and brown communities with total impunity. But it also means that we must do so through the direct organizing of and direct action by the communities involved, by building self-defense networks capable of directly resisting the violence of racist policing and the deportation apparatus. Two struggles that, if united, will truly be able to throw American white supremacy into a hopefully uncontrolled chaos. Real resistance, in short, begins with building a fighting left, a left capable of bringing the fight to the enemy, the white supremacist, misogynistic, global capitalist enemy. And real resistance in this sense is not only about resisting, but it's also about winning as well. Thank you.
I like the idea of getting up.
You can sit if you want.
Good evening to you all, and thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me. although I suggest that next time we have a more balanced panel. It's usually now a practice to have at least 40-40 or at least 40%, the others. Okay. Oh, you have to forgive me, first of all, I'm very tired. I just came back from Europe, and for me, even standing is a little bit of a problem right now. But I'll try to do my best. I don't have prepared notes, so I'll share with you some simple reflection. First, I don't have a strategy for the left, mostly because I'm not so sure any longer what is the left. I imagine that under the category today, there are very different conceptions, and it will be very interesting, in fact, to begin to understand what we mean by left today. Also, I can only offer the political reflection that comes from my experience as a woman, as a feminist, who for many years have done political work within a feminist movement. And so the vision of the future and the vision of the present that I want to share with you comes from that. Now, one question has been asked is, how do we got here? And I think there is a general understanding on the panel, and I think in this room, that we are here because we are facing a social system that for hundreds of years has ruled with violence, with slavery, with a constant creation of scarcity, dispossession, and the system has been able at times to provide some prosperity for a limited set of the world population and for a limited period of time. But today, more than ever, has dropped these masks, also because it has been challenged. And I refer here to the 60s and 70s, a period in which many, many struggles have come together, have culminated to create a very, I don't say historically unique, but certainly a very powerful historical situation. The situation in which you have, in a sense, all the oppressed by capitalism revolt, challenge the colonies, industrial workers, students, feminists, women. And what we have witnessed during the last 4 decades is a response to that threat. Capitalism doesn't change unless it has to. And it has changed, restructuring the world economy, restructuring everything so that everything could remain the same, in order to really give itself new foundation. And to do that, it has used the strategy that capitalism always has used in its history to consolidate itself, to accumulate, which is to expropriate people, which is to push people away from their land, and to create new division, to accumulate new divisions among us. This is the situation that we are confronting today. It's a situation that in different ways has repeated itself throughout the history of capitalism. But certainly we do feel a sense of urgency, the sense of urgency that comes from the fact that the destructive power at the hands of the capitalist class internationally is not only American capitalism. It's not only American capitalism. I think it's very important that we speak of international capitalism. Capitalism is global today. It's not only based in the United States. It has a particular lethal history and a particular savage history. But capitalism today is international and governs itself with international institutions. Now, what I want to talk about, though, also, is that if we have to think and understand how we got here, we also have to understand the mistakes that we have made in the past. It is true that capitalism has its bombs, its cops, its jails, its slave owners, but it's also important that we analyze, what have been the strategies that movements have adopted in the past, and whether some of these strategies we need to rethink. And here I want to speak in particular, of the mistakes, for instance, that the feminist movement of which I was part has made, that in my view have opened the way, facilitated a whole work of repression that has unfolded through the 80s and 90s and continues to this day. And I refer in particular to the fact that even though the feminist movement was extremely powerful in that it was able to open up and make visible a whole area of exploitation that had been completely ignored by the movements, the socialist movements, and the movements of the left in general in the past. The whole sphere of reproduction, the whole sphere of domestic relations, sexuality, procreation, and showing how capitalism has in fact been able to consolidate itself, accumulate its wealth, and maintain low the cost of reproducing a workforce, by appropriating women's labor, by appropriating women's unpaid labor. Even though the women's movement was able to show that, and I think in that way change our conception not only of the position of women in society, but the conception of what capitalism itself is, because it shows that capitalism has been feeding upon a huge amount of unpaid labor, far greater than was ever imagined by the founding father of the socialist movement. And that gender relation and gender hierarchies have been extremely powerful in pacifying the working class. So even though the women's movement was able to show that, nevertheless, it was not able to find a strategy to change that. And in fact, for very soon, the strategy the women's movement adopted was to concentrate all its efforts on entering male-dominated areas of work and fight for equality, or even though we had established that the fundamental areas of exploitation for women was the whole area of reproduction. But by the mid-70s, the terrain of reproduction was practically abandoned by most feminists. Not all. I was one of those who did not. Together with many other women I was involved with in the Wages for Housework movement. But by 1975, 1976, practically the whole issue of reproduction was abandoned. So much so, for instance, that feminists did not even fight for maternity leave. We are one of the few countries in the world in which we don't have a federally mandated maternity leave. Women have to fight now, job by job, in order to be able to have that. Worse yet, the feminist movement did not fight to support the welfare women, the National Welfare Mothers Organization, that already in the 70s was coming under attack. In fact, you had women who were completely vilified. And I could speak much longer about the consequences of that vilification. But there was no real support by the feminist movement. And with the consequence of really creating a rift, for instance, between white women and black women, because the welfare movement was a movement led mostly by black women. Not because welfare was a black issue, on the contrary, most people on welfare were white people, but because black women were more combative, more well organized, and they were the ones who made the fight to tell the state, this is not charity. Every woman, this was their slogan, is a working mother. Every mother is a working woman, sorry. Every mother is a working woman. Since the women's movement was always talking about the working woman, the working woman, the working woman. And I think this was a terrible mistake. Another terrible mistake, for instance, was to fight for abortion and to call that fight, control over our bodies, ignoring that at the very time in which there were massive demonstrations for abortion in the street, women on welfare were being sterilized. And coming out of giving birth, they were given a piece of paper and told that if they didn't sign and accept to have their tube cut, they would be cut off the rolls. And so the mistake of calling abortion choice, when in fact choice would have been to fight for the possibility for women to have children without having to pay that decision with their own life and with a lot of poverty and work. So again, the list is very long, actually. Again, the struggle against domestic violence, against violence by men against women, which very often led to a collaboration of feminists with the police to demand more severe penalties, despite the fact, the knowledge, certainly in the black community, that demanding the state, asking the state to protect us was quite the wrong strategy, since ultimately it was the state that was responsible to begin with for the kind of tolerance of domestic violence that women are confronted. I say all this, and with great pain, but I say it because I think we also need to understand that even though capitalism is very powerful, we also have to learn from the strategy and the mistakes of the past, because what we do or what we do not do has an impact, on the capitalist response to us. So in this spirit, I want to say that today we are in a different situation from the situation in the 70s. Whereas in the 70s a lot of feminists abandoned reproduction, today the whole issue of social reproduction is becoming actually very popular. I'm almost suspicious of it because everybody now is talking about social reproduction. But this is very good, and I think that one reason why the question of social reproduction is now so central. Even men are writing about social reproduction. It's certainly because the idea, the hope that many feminists had that, entering male-dominated area would be a path of emancipation, that hope has vanished. Certainly, a lot of women have been able to gain more power by entering the wage workforce, entering certain type of occupation before forbidden to us. But for the majority of women, right, in fact, working outside the home has not provided any autonomy, has not provided any of the rewards, that were the social power that in the feminist imagination of the 70s was associated with working outside the home. And in fact, we now have a whole population of women who are living in a situation of constant crisis in the US. And I'm sure you're very familiar with what I'm saying. Crisis in the sense of working, no money, no security for the future. You have now the majority of working class women have either 2 jobs or a lot of debts. Women are the ones who have the largest number of debt in this country. Deaths about health care, deaths about education, deaths about mortgages, and deaths about everyday life. For instance, women are the largest number of people who go to the payday loaners, those vultures who have opened up their companies just in coordination with women entering the wage workforce. What happens is that, women are getting their wages and immediately they use the wage to run for the loan because the wage is never enough. And they also have the highest number of use of tranquilizer and antidepressant. And recently, also, major increase in suicide. This is only a part of the crisis of reproduction that we are facing. I could spend the evening elaborating on it, enough to say what is happening to children. I went to the latest statistic and they keep growing. Now more than 8 million children are declared to have mental problems and are given some kind of drug or more drugs a day, and the number is growing. What does it mean? It means that there is no time, no resources for children today. No time, no resources, and their dissatisfaction, their dissatisfaction is being medicalized. It's being medicalized. We call attention deficit a mental problem when the problem is schooling. It's schools that are not providing children with, any path to creativity. And the elderly, and the violence. If we speak of reproduction, then how we can live in a society, where continuously the state has the right to kill with total impunity youth in the street. So this is where the sense of urgency, and this is the reason why I think that today, the question of reproduction is coming to the foreground. And I think that this is very, very important, because I think that organizing on the terrain of reproduction is the first and most important step to rebuild our society. And first of all, to reconstitute a certain type of social fabric that neoliberalism has completely destroyed. Now, in the past, I've campaigned with many other women on the question of wages for housework, which was hard for us, was not a payment for domestic work, but it was a strategy of refusal to give capitalism, free labor. It was a refusal of unpaid labor. And it was the beginning of a process of reappropriation of wealth. Since then, my horizon of what reproduction is and what the struggle over reproduction is has also expanded. I realize today that the whole issue of reproduction, for instance, extends to the environment, to the question of food, to the control of our genetic material. In Nicaragua, women speak of feminism as, they say, well, feminism is organizing seed banks, because we begin to organize now reproduction, making sure that what we put in our mouth, in our stomach, in our bodies, in our children's body is not something that is going to poison us. So the issue of reproduction is much broader. And although I believe that we still need to make a struggle to redirect the resources of society in the direction of our reproductive activity, we need to change the flow as to where the wealth is going. For instance, the United States government is planning to spend $1 trillion in the next 10 years to refurbish its nuclear arsenal, land missile, air missiles, submarines. That's an obscenity. That's a crime. And we need to stop that. And certainly, it would be a great objective to think of a big organizing to change the flow of the money and resources that go into that project. But also, we need to change the way our reproduction is organized. Those who have read my work, who have heard me speak, know that over the last few years, I've spoken a lot about the politics of the commons and reproductive commons. And I often mention how inspired I've been in it by the politics of women's movement, women's grassroots movement in South America. And I have to say that this is really, for me, has been a major, major political experience, because what I have seen has been that in the face of expropriation, in the face of being forced out of their rural area and being forced to urbanize, and in the face also of intense political repression. Many communities, and women in particular, have responded, by creating more communitarian forms of life, by doing collective work, and through collective work, building new communities, creating, for example, public kitchens, collective kitchens, creating urban garden, making decisions through assemblies. This has been true in Chile after the coup, has been true in Argentina in 2000 with the Piquetera movement, and it's true today in many of the favelas and the villas of Argentina, Brazil. And the power of these initiatives has not only been that they have provided a security, a guarantee of survival, or a possibility of survival to populations that have been completely expropriated, but they have also reconstituted relation of solidarity. They have reconstituted, the fabric of society in a way that has enabled people to resist, or better, as some have said, to defend, what they've been able to construct. And I think that this is a lesson that for me applies, here as well. And I think we have seen with the Occupy movement and also with Standing Rock how important it has been, right? The creation, the collective creation, or better, the creation of collective forms of reproduction to enable people to survive, to thrive, for a long period of time, and to create a new social relation among them. Because I think that in the process of fighting for, more survival possibility, more security, also a new world of relation is also being created. And I want to conclude here saying that building reproductive commons is not the end of the struggle. Obviously, what we need is a movement that has many, many fronts. It's a movement that is also capable of fighting on many levels. But at the same time, it's a strategy that I think is indispensable, not only from the point of view of survival, but is indispensable also from the point of view of creating the kind of infrastructure for our struggles that we need to confront the state and to disarm the state. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Let's see, people are... I have a question for Juan to start with. George raised the question of the relationship of what mass action, direct action, mass protest, and elections. Juan, how do you assess the importance of this fight that's going on inside the Democratic Party?
In terms of seeking control of the party or seeking control of the agenda for what happens at the municipal or the government level?
Well, I would say it's at all the levels. There's this fight between people that call themselves the progressive wing of the party, the Sanders wing of the party. It's happening nationally. It's certainly happening in primaries at every level. How important is that? What's the relationship, do you think, of that to the kind of organizing in the streets George was talking about?
Well, to some degree, I believe that the rise of Bernie Sanders was made possible by the fact that there were already these local struggles going on in various cities and across the country, and people then gravitated toward a national spokesman for a movement that was already in existence. And I think that, again, many of us in this room have been at this for a long time. And I think that the reality is you do not build power to make social transformation in a deep way unless you educate and organize people at the local level. Because it's not just a question of seizing power, it's a question of transforming people. It's because if anything that was taught to us by the social experiments of Russia and China and so many of these other countries, it's not sufficient just to seize the political power. You have to transform the society, and you can't. And the way you transform the society is by organizing and building a new way of looking at the world. And I don't think you do that top down. You do that bottom up. And so why I believe that it's important that none of these local elected officials that I name would have been able to come to power unless there were already movements at the grassroots level that were developing and then saw in them at that particular moment the best expression of what that movement was about. And so I think that, and then you constantly have to hold them accountable, because I don't care who they are, once they get into power, power is an aphrodisiac. You know, it changes people. So you have to constantly hold them accountable. And you're not guaranteed that the people who you sent up into power are going to be the same people 2 years later or 5 years later or 8 years later. And so it's a constant battle for first to build a movement that gets people into a position where they can actually affect policies and governance, but then holding those people accountable. And sometimes you're not going to win. But that doesn't mean you don't fight just because you're not going to win. You just have to keep at it. And I think, so that my sense is that too many people get fixated at what's happening at the national level and not sufficiently at the grassroots level. The best thing I think that Bernie Sanders did after he was not able to win the nomination of the Democratic Party is he told his followers, run for office yourself. Build movements at the local level. Make the revolution, the political revolution that I've been talking about at your local level as best as possible. So.
George, Gerald, do you want to weigh in on that? Is that a yes or no?
No, I'll endorse my friend's remarks.
There's only a few minutes left. Does anyone have a burning question? And we're not really set up for them, so you're going to have to make it really a question and not a comment. And you're going to have to yell, and I'll try to repeat it. Go ahead.
This is a question for the whole panel. Can you say something about what Mike Davis has called the planet of slums? Was it 3 billion people who are living on under $4 a day in these mega slums of millions? What of them? What of them in our vision of the global future?
So the question is, Mike Davis has talked about a planet of the slums, and what role does this play, and how do we speak to that? And Silvia, you were nodding your head, so I'm going to give it to you.
I want to say that I've often said, Mike Davis speaks of a planet of slums. I think we should also speak of a planet of commons. Because, those slums are very rich in activities, are very rich in struggles. And I think to talk simply as slums, it's a way of victimizing a whole population that in fact is fighting, is defending, organizing collectively and really creating new relationships.
I think that's a great question. I think it gets to deep historical questions on the left about who is the so-called revolutionary subject, right? This idea in Orthodox Marxism that it's this an industrial working class. Well, this has simply never been the majority of those struggling over labor and overwork on a global level. And particularly if you talk about a place like Latin America, where already decades ago, so-called informal labor was the majority of workers. People that were not working in a factory, did not confront a boss. They were working on the streets. They were living in barrios, in slums, in favelas, and they were organizing. If we look particularly in a lot of cases, but the case I know best is Venezuela, they began to organize less in the workplace and more in the community. They began to do community level, localized organizing that was directly democratic, that sought control over their territory, that sought safety, and that sought, to develop programming and for their children and for schools. And so in a way it shifted the entire locus of political organizing. And you think, well, it's about Latin America. Well, that was what was happening in the Black Panther Party as well, when, Black Panthers said, our location of struggle is the streets as well. It's not necessarily the workplace from which we're being tendentially excluded. So we're talking about what it means, as, Fanon put it, to organize those with the most chains, those with the least to lose, and those who, historically speaking, have been the ones who have most often sparked off the most radical upsurges in human history.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Asantua Nkrumah Ture. My question is for Sister Silvia Federici. What are your thoughts about the recent vote in Ireland, the amendment regarding abortion? I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Actually, I jubilated because I know what it meant. I was very happy, and I know because I know what that meant, particularly in Ireland, with the grip of the church. You know, this church has been so repressive, so reactionary. And I know what I said about, you know, making the fight only for abortion. But I think that certainly, I mean, what I know of the Irish women's movement is that they're not only looking at abortion as the end of it, first of all. And second, it was a great victory in terms of the forces they had against them.
My question is about the Democratic Party and Bernie Sanders. Since it was Bernie Sanders who encouraged his followers to vote for Hillary Clinton, what does that say about the left wing of the Democratic Party that Bernie Sanders says that he stands for? In addition, Mr. Bernie Sanders have never ventured beyond the U.S. to talk about U.S. imperialism. So I wonder what you thought about that. And secondly, with respect to the neoliberal Democrats, even in the city of New York, who poses as progressives, but went on to vote for every major legislation proposed by the de Blasio administration and his rezoning proposals, which my friends and I, activists, housing activists, described as gentrification on steroids. And so when we look at so-called progressive Democrats, exactly whom and what are we talking about? My name is Nellie Bailey.
Gerald, do you want to take the first part of it? Sanders part?
Well, certainly my argument is not with Nellie Bailey, that's for sure. And I think, I said certainly my argument is not with the speaker, who I think speaks, quite frankly, in an objective sense to the fact that I was trying to articulate, that this way this settler colonial regime has been constructed, it has organically developed a very strong right-wing force that, like a powerful magnet, drives many of us, sometimes willingly, sometimes against our will, to the right. And my own position is that I have a very strident position against some of the forces within the Democratic Party, but ultimately, I think our immediate struggle is to defeat Trumpism, as I said in my opening remarks, in November 2018 and November 2020.
Juan, do you want to talk a bit about that and de Blasio?
Yeah, I think on the housing issue, there is no doubt in my mind, and I've said so repeatedly, that not only the de Blasio administration, but many of the, quote, progressive or liberal mayors around the country have not addressed the reality that gentrification continues to spread and market forces continue to run amok in every major city in America. And more working class and low-income people are being forced out. That is not only a reality now, but this has been a gathering crisis. Back in 1968, a commission appointed by President Johnson, the Commission on the American City, said back in 1968, 50 years ago, that the private market left to its own will never build low-cost housing. that only government intervention could assure low-cost housing in America, and it said in 1968 that there was a housing crisis. And that crisis has continued to accelerate. We all see it with the homeless population, whether you go to Seattle or LA or New York or DC, it doesn't matter where you go. But the problem is that the federal governments and the state governments have completely gotten out of doing any kind of intervention on the housing market. So therefore, you're a progressive mayor in a capitalist system, and you're trying to figure out how are you going to build housing when you have no federal help, no state help. So what a lot of these mayors have done is they've said to the private sector, the only thing that we have is height. We can rezone and build higher and maybe get you to give us some crumbs of affordable housing. It's not a good strategy. It's a weak strategy. It's going to further accelerate gentrification, and I completely agree with all the housing activists who were opposed to the rezonings of the de Blasio administration. And I've continually been critical of that. However, housing is not the only issue that's being dealt with. It's a critical issue. I look back, and let me give you the names. William O'Dwyer, Vincent Impellitteri, Robert Wagner, John Lindsay, Abe Bean, Ed Koch, Dave Dinkins, Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg. Those are all the mayors of New York City since Fiorello LaGuardia was mayor over 70 years ago. None of them, including Lindsay, who probably was close to the best, none of them have had a more overall progressive policies on of a range of issues than Bill de Blasio has. That doesn't mean that Bill de Blasio is perfect, but it means how far back do you want to go before you find somebody that is at least you can be supportive of in some of their policies. Not all of them. You're not going to agree with them on all of the policies. Yes, what part of stop and frisk? The part that ended stop and frisk, or the part? Yes, I agree with you. It's still happening. Why? Because every mayor in America, whether progressive, conservative, or centrist, has to deal with the fact that police departments are the army of every city. They have their own minds. You as a political, you asked me the question, let me finish. You as a political leader have to figure out how you deal with the fact that you have an army that could be hostile to you and that doesn't necessarily go along with your policies. So what I'm saying is that, we can have this argument, you can have it in any city in America. There'll never be a mayor that meets all of our needs until we live in a different kind of society. But you have to decide at any stage in your struggle who is at least representing a good portion of what you're trying to get, and you continue to criticize them on those things that they have clearly fallen short on.
Okay, we got 5 minutes left, so I want to. This is the beginning of a whole other panel, and hopefully we get to do this. But we got 5 minutes. Can I ask you, please, a really short question? We have 5 minutes.
Okay, I want to address my question to Silvia Federici. Okay, Silvia, while I understand that capitalism should not get away with this huge free labor support of women's unpaid work, I nonetheless think that by suggesting that feminists made a mistake by going into, quote, male-dominated areas when the entire world was male-dominated is to say that we should relinquish our hold on trying to have any piece of this world and go back to our assigned sphere of domesticity. And I have to, radically disagree with that. And I also wonder why you weren't saying any of the, really telling men to change anything, but only saying all the things that women, being in the kind of situation we are in this male-dominated world, should have changed.
I didn't say that women should not enter male-dominated world. I said that they abandoned the question of reproduction. That's a big difference. I didn't say the women should stay home and should not go out of the home to work.
You
I
labeled-
said that the problem is, let me finish, the problem is that by 1976, I lived that period, and I remember very well. It was very difficult. There was no real mass mobilization to fight against, the vilification of women on welfare, to support women on welfare, for example. There was no mobilization in favor of demanding maternity leave. There was no massive mobilization on the question of maternity leave. In fact, I remember very well, it was said, if we ask for this privilege, it was seen as a privilege, we will not have the right to demand equality in the wage workplace. This is the mistake. So the question was not that, everybody should stay home and be happy doing the housework. The question was, once we discover, once we unveil all the exploitation that is taking place in the home, sexuality, the power relation built upon it, what capitalism has done with the use of the male wage, that delegating to men, for example, really the power over women through the wage, even the power to punish them corporally if they do not perform on the housework. I mean, that's why domestic violence has always been tolerated. Once you uncover that, then that becomes an important strategic terrain of struggle. I think the mistake was to say, okay, we'll get rid of this by going out the home, etc., etc. So I think I really want to clarify that. No exaltation of domesticity, I assure you.
Okay, a couple of minutes left. Really quickly, please.
Thank you all for your comments. Like a number of you, I work with young folks day in, day out, and I see a lot of what I would consider political idolatry among them. They worship idols in the figures of politicians, cultural icons, and a whole range of other persons who really don't have their own interests at heart. What can we do as organizers and organic intellectuals to destroy the cult of demagoguery that seems to pervade a lot of progressive and even radical politics? I mean, how can we move closer to Fanon's vision of a world in which not only the idols of oppression have been shattered, but the very platforms upon which those idols can be placed no longer exist?
George, you want to?
That's an amazing question, and I think it's essential because it also is not just about those oppressing us. You're talking about these dynamics that function within within the mentality and the subjectivity of everyday people and people who are being oppressed, and how those function. And so when Marx talks about the fetish, right? He's talking about capitalism and about its fetishistic character. What he means is that something, a commodity that's made by human beings, is taken and projected above us as though it were a thing that we had nothing to do with, that we have no power over. And part of what he's trying to say is that we need to de-fetishize. We need to destroy that fetish and understand that this is a social relation. And the same thing happens when it comes to everything you're talking about. We talked about this a few times already tonight. Political leaders, we put them there. Political organizing puts them there. Individuals struggling put them there. And then we act as if they got there by themselves, by their own merit. Even political leaders of radical organizations. If you're talking about cultural icons, these things are all created by human beings. And I think one of the most important things we can do, especially with young people, is to train them in the fact that they themselves can create, right? And that they themselves have this power. And the only best way to show them that is not to tell them, but is to give them that power in organizing, in self-organizing, in engaging in cultural and political production on their own, so that they can see they themselves have control over these things.
We have one more question.
Thank you for your remarks. I don't expect a quick answer to this, but I would like to ask the other members of the panel how they integrate the questions of reproduction that Silvia Federici raised, because it really shouldn't simply be ghettoized as a concern it really needs to be integrated.
That is, you just opened a big conversation, and I've been told we're supposed to be ending at 8:30. It is 8:30, and there's supposed to be time for a book signing. So is there one of you that would like to answer that? Because I don't think there's time for all of us.
I'll just say briefly that I've written at length and am part of many discourses on the question of reproduction of enslaved African women and how they were forced into reproduction, how they were forced into reproduction and their children were taken away from them, which in some ways is a precedent for what may be happening on the border, because I've been reading these conflicting stories about children being taken from the arms of their mothers. And so I think that there are many different angles that one can take with regard to the question of reproduction, and that's a particular angle that has occupied my attention for some time.
Again, this is kind of just the beginning, but we do have to draw to an end. So first of all, I'd like to thank the panel. Remind everyone that all the panel is coming over for a book signing, so you'll be able to carry on some of this conversation. Thank you all for coming.